It was a big hit for the Andrews sisters that winter in 1941. You could rent a 5-room apartment at Nob Hill with a magnificent view for $75 a month. It was a pleasant Sunday in the Bay Area. It was sunny with just a little touch of winter in the air. Some people would be heading for the plunge at Sutro Baths, and then maybe splurge as much as $1 for a Sunday dinner at the Cliff House. And a real sport could take his date to Monaco's, the International Settlement. Dinner and a floor show, $1.25. Alice Faye and John Payne were in Weekend in Havana at the El Capitan Theater on Mission Street. Buddy Rogers headlined RKO Vaudeville at the Golden Gate. And there were rave reviews for Catherine Cornell on stage at the Curran in The Doctor's Dilemma. Bruce Brothers was advertising, buy your son his first tuxedo for Christmas, $30. And the latest Gallup poll showed that 80% of all Americans opposed going to war. Hitler's invasion of Russia was stalled right at the gates of Moscow. And President Roosevelt was appealing to Japan's emperor to stop all that saber rattling. Hirohito's emissaries were to meet with the State Department in Washington that very day.
Interrupt this program to bring you a special news bulletin. The Japanese have attacked Pearl Harbor, Hawaii by air, President Roosevelt has just announced. The attack also was made on all naval and military activities on the principal island of Oahu.
It was incredible. It was unbelievable. Yet here it was. War had caught up with us on a December Sunday. And our San Francisco Bay Area lives, for so long insulated from much of the world's troubles, just changed. Dramatically and forever. I'm Russ Coughlin, inviting you to return to that time when Pearl Harbor lay in ruins. And perhaps the next target would be right here on San Francisco Bay.
The attack of Pearl Harbor can be repeated at any one of many points in both oceans and along both our coastlines.
San Francisco, not London, is the dateline for this picture of sandbagging for defense. The Pacific Telephone and Telegraph Company building is safeguarded as a vital center for cross-country communication.
From Seattle to San Diego, there was a very real expectation of an attack on mainland. Nowhere was it more evident than right here in San Francisco. Now, that seems far-fetched today. Remember this, that in 1941, San Francisco was the transportation center, the communication center, and the financial heart for all of Western America. The entire Army's Western Defense Command and the 6th Army were headquartered right here at the Presidio. And over at Treasure Island was the headquarters for the Navy's Western Sea Frontier, the 12th Navy District, and much of all of that command apparatus that had been knocked out at Pearl Harbor. And there were ammunition dumps, airfields, defense plants, docks, and shipyards all around the bay. We were a natural target, and we knew it. And more evidence of just how vulnerable we were kept arriving at our front door every day.
In San Francisco, the visual evidence of Remember Pearl Harbor arrives. Wounded and burned soldiers and sailors, and by the hundreds, women and children, many of whose loved ones were killed by the Mikado's madmen.
Also in San Francisco, the bullet-riddled Philippine clipper gets war paint after arriving with a heroic crew aboard. They eyewitnessed the terrific bombing of Wake Island and rescued the island's Pan American Airways personnel.
"31 survivors of a brutal Japanese submarine attack arrive at a West Coast naval base. Their ship, the tanker Amedio, was torpedoed and shelled off the California coast. More grim realism for an aroused nation. The lumber-laden freighter Absaroka is torpedoed 6 miles off the coast, in full view of Californians on shore. A 63-year-old seaman died a hero's death. The rest of the crew reached shore in lifeboats.
With ships being torpedoed and shelled within sight of California beaches, a few families living alongside of San Francisco's marina sold their expensive homes and fled. And although there were rumors of an invasion fleet off the Mexican coast, the threat of invasion didn't seem as real as possible naval bombardments, air raids, and sabotage. Stories of sabotage at Pearl Harbor were rampant. And every one of those reports were later proven false, but hey, they were readily believed in December of 1941. Local Japanese all up and down the coast, whether they were American citizens or not, were under suspicion as spies, fifth columnists, saboteurs. They were stopped and questioned by soldiers and police everywhere. By the end of the month, the United States Attorney General had authorized search warrants for the house of any enemy alien. That triggered random searches of thousands of homes and businesses owned by people with Japanese names. Their cultural and business organizations protested that they were loyal to America, but their voices were drowned out by a growing drumbeat of racism. Every Japanese was labeled an enemy, and terms like Jap and Nip were the tamest epithets in the headlines.
A mad Japanese dog strikes in the Pacific, and Washington State Department gives the incredible news to reporters who had been awaiting news of peace negotiations with the sly, war-crazed Japs. Kurusu and Nomura give their oiliest smile, while bombs are actually falling on Hawaii. Daybreak attacks on Hawaii and the Philippine Islands force America into active combat against the scheming and ruthless Japs, the LYBs, the little yellow bellies who claim the rising sun for their own.
It was not a good time to be an American with Japanese ancestors, and it would get worse. For now, they and all other enemy aliens were ordered away from ports and harbors. That effectively shut down the fishing fleet at Monterey. It also hit Fisherman's Wharf in San Francisco, but for a different reason. Well, Italians who had never gotten around to citizenship papers were also listed as enemy aliens. And this part of the city was solidly Italian, with 2 Italian-language newspapers feuding over who was the most loyal to the United States. Well, the truth was that Mussolini never really had much of a following here, but 2,000 Italians were employed in the fishing industry, and 1,400 of them never become citizens. Now they were forbidden to even visit the waterfront, much less live or work there. And it would be 10 months before the order was modified and the Italians could return to their boats. And by then, it would be too late for fishermen whose heritage was Japanese. Italian and German nationals were also required to turn in radios, cameras, anything that might be used as a weapon. And for Japanese, that order included not only aliens, but United States citizens as well. The FBI looked over the mountains of stuff turned in or seized in raids on stores and homes and reported, none of it is sinister. There's no evidence any was intended for subversive use. And yet, J. Edgar Hoover was warning.
We ask every citizen to immediately report any information regarding espionage, sabotage, or un-American activities to the Federal Bureau of Investigation.
Let's remember Pearl Harbor as we go to meet the foe.
It was a time of unbridled patriotism, but Japanese Americans need not apply. German Americans were suspect too, especially those who spoke with an accent. And as for Italian Americans, well, Mussolini seemed more a clown and a stooge than a villain. And besides, when our mayor's name was Angelo Rossi and our biggest sports hero was Joe DiMaggio, how could Italian Americans be subversive?
Let's remember Pearl Harbor and go on to victory.
Well, despite that home front bravado, the news from the Pacific during those early months was all bad. Hong Kong, Shanghai, and Singapore fell. And then Wake Island and Guam, Burma, Borneo, Bougainville, Thailand, and Malaya all quickly overrun. then New Guinea, finally the Philippines. General MacArthur pulled out.
I shall return.
And he left General Jonathan Wainwright to make a last stand on the island of Corregidor in Manila Bay. Outflanked, outnumbered, outgunned. The surrender of more than 75,000 Americans and Filipinos marked one of the most infamous incidents of the Pacific War. The prisoners were herded on a 100-mile trail of humiliation, torture, and bestiality that was branded the Bataan Death March. At home, the San Francisco News was compiling an honor roll signed by thousands of local servicemen. When one was killed in action, a gold star was placed beside the name. A lot of gold stars were being added to those pages. And meanwhile, the Lurleen and her sister ships were turning around and heading back to the Pacific. The luxury liner had been halfway between Hawaii and San Francisco when the first bombs fell. With 700 nervous passengers, she raced a zigzag course for the mainland under full steam. And in a complete blackout, she cleared the Golden Gate at 3 a.m. December 10th and was home. Union Iron Works in San Francisco had been told to arm and refit the Lurleen and her sisters, the Mariposa, the Monterey, and the Matsonia as troop carriers. And they were given just 4 days. Everyone knew it was impossible, but they did it. And now, the Lurleen was jammed with 4,200 troops, 6 times her civilian capacity. They shipped out fresh from basic training. Green youngsters. Most would become aged very soon. Some would never get the chance.
Goodbye, Mama. I'm off to Yokohama for my country, my flag and you.
On the day we went to war, most small towns around the bay were already feeling the pulse and sometimes the pain of a wartime boom. Mare Island Naval Shipyard erupted with activity, and the population of Vallejo doubled, and then doubled again within just 2 years. Los Gatos now had the biggest cement plant in the world, built almost overnight, and its miles of conveyor belts groaned and clanked through the canyons of the San Carlos Mountains. Those new Kaiser shipyards in the North Bay were running day and night, and they had just about overwhelmed Richmond with 90,000 new workers and more on the way. Long freight trains were pulling into the Richmond Tank Depot, loaded with trucks, snowplows, tanks, personnel carriers. And now, as often as not, it was women who were handling those big machines.
Show the Japs that in their treacherous stab in the back at Pearl Harbor, they not only picked on the wrong men, but also on the wrong women.
Millions of American women are working now in war plants of all kinds. But even more of us women are needed. The fact is that women are needed for all kinds of jobs in many parts of the country.
Thank you, Kate Smith.
This was an exception in the booming Bay Area. 3 months after Pearl Harbor, Sausalito was still a quiet little community. Not much had happened here since the Golden Gate Bridge builders had finished their job. It was on a February day in 1942 that the town joined the home front. That was when a couple of engineers and a project manager from W.A. Bechtel Company stood on a hill above Richardson's Bay. And what they decided, right then and there, changed Sausalito with an incredible speed. 3 weeks later, 40 houses had been moved or bulldozed. The hill at Pine Point was blown up. The tide flats were being filled in. The construction of a shipyard was underway. The keel for the first ship was laid while the yard was still being built. And workers were being recruited from all over the country. 9 out of 10 had never even seen a shipyard before. They would be trained on the job. In 5 months, they had produced their first ocean-going vessel. 4 more ships would be delivered by the end of the year. Every day, in shifts around the clock, 20,000 workers went through the gates to Marinship. Newcomers were put up in house trailers, railroad cars, barns, a deserted gas station, converted garages, and in summer cabins in Lagunitas, Woodacre, and Stinson Beach. And there was a cow pasture across the highway from Marinship. In 3 days, plans were drawn up to turn it into Marin City. And it became an instant home to 3,500. Before Marin City was a year old, the population was over 5,000. They were a hardy bunch, those shipbuilders on Richardson's Bay. Before they were through, the Marin ship gang would turn out 93 freighters and tankers and collect just about every award there was for speed, quality, and innovation.
Just about the time that the very first shipyard workers were arriving in Sausalito, the first Japanese were leaving their homes in California for a very uncertain future. And this was the reason. An executive order signed by the president was authorizing the War Department to establish military areas wherever they felt it necessary, and to keep out anyone that they thought was dangerous. Well, to Lieutenant General John L. DeWitt, there was no question about who and what that meant. The general declared the entire West Coast a military zone.
As to who was to be kicked out, these are his words. Along the vital Pacific coast, over 112,000 potential enemies of Japanese extraction are at large today. There are indications that these are organized and ready for concerted action at a favorable opportunity. So, more than 100,000 people were given 48 hours notice to sell their homes and businesses and to get rid of most of their belongings. They were herded into fairgrounds, racetracks, and stadiums, then bussed under armed guard to detainment camps. That's where most would spend the rest of the war behind barbed wire. 2/3 were born in the United States, were American citizens. The rest had been in the country at least 18 years, most of them much longer. The sons and grandsons of many would serve with distinction and heroism in the American forces. Now, both the FBI and Army intelligence said that such a wholesale roundup was unwise and unnecessary. But most West Coast newspapers, radio commentators, and a growing number of politicians had supported it. So had the Grange, labor unions, the American Legion, and business groups. With most of the general public, incarceration of the Japanese was a popular move. General DeWitt was delighted. Some 5,000 of those interned Japanese were from San Francisco. And the Japanese Tea Garden right here in Golden Gate Park was renamed the Oriental Tea Garden. It's an appropriate place to reflect on this irony. Now, during the entire course of the war, not one Japanese American was ever found to be a spy or a saboteur. Now, that's not to say that Japan didn't have spies in this country. Indeed, during the war years, 10 people were convicted of spying for Japan. All of them were Caucasians. At about the time that the Japanese in the rice-growing communities and truck farms of the Sacramento Delta were getting the order to move out, a top-secret meeting was going on just downriver at the Benicia Arsenal. Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle was telling specialists there that he needed an unusual kind of incendiary bomb designed with delayed fuses that would allow very low-flying planes to escape before they exploded. Now, in 2 days, those top-secret fuses and bombs were developed, packed, and dispatched through the Alameda Air Terminal. And by April 18th, 1942, they were here aboard the aircraft carrier Hornet off the coast of Japan. The bombs were loaded aboard 16 Army B-25s. These were not airplanes designed to be flown off of a carrier. It was 8:25 a.m. Voice of Colonel Doolittle.
Each pilot, co-pilot, bombardier, navigator, gunner, and the ground crews were volunteers and were carefully trained for the specific mission. We approached the targets right on the treetops, pulled up to about 1,500 feet, and dropped our bombs. The damage done was terrific, both because of the low altitude and because of the highly inflammable nature of Japanese structures. The targets selected were all of a military nature. Among them was a cruiser. A salvo of bombs left it enveloped in flames.
The daring raid on Tokyo and the Yokosuka Navy base was a sensation. In Japan, whose citizens had been told that no enemy could ever attack their islands, the reaction was stunned amazement, disbelief, and in some cases, shame. In China, where most of the planes crash-landed or were ditched, the crews were welcomed as heroes by Madame Chiang Kai-shek. 71 of the 80 men in the raid survived. Here at home, Jimmy Doolittle got the Medal of Honor. and the nation got the first big morale boost of the war. Well, for the first time since Pearl Harbor, we weren't retreating. We could actually cheer for Americans on the attack. And yet, if you were living in San Francisco at the time, there was another raid that you'd remember even longer. It was the great San Francisco air raid, the one that never happened. That part of our story is next. When the first bombs fell on Hawaii, Americans really had no idea of how to make war. Not yet. And nowhere was this more evident than in this city on the day after Pearl Harbor. It was Monday evening, December 8th, 1941. The 4th Interceptor Command had picked up the drone of unidentified enemy squadrons, 100 miles off the coast and flying right for the Golden Gate. Sirens shrieked the alert and searchlights began sweeping all of the sky on the lookout for the Japanese planes. And the hundreds of anti-aircraft guns were in place all over the city, were manned and loaded and prepared for firing. Switches were pulled and the streetlights blinked out. Navy vessels slipped out the gate while Army pursuit planes scouted out 600 miles looking for the enemy carrier. Yet, throughout the business district, neon lights blazed, Christmas shoppers bustled in and out of stores, restaurants kept serving, and nightclub bands played on. Alcatraz was a glowing beacon in the middle of the bay. And as the Chronicle reported, blacked out San Francisco sparkled like New Orleans at Mardi Gras time. Some people laughed, and others said it was just practice or an outright hoax. And the hills and the rooftops were all crowded with San Franciscans who came up to see the action. It was almost a party atmosphere. The next morning, with the city still intact, the Western Defense Commander was furious. General DeWitt stormed into Mayor Rossi's City Hall office, and this is part of what he shouted. "You people do not seem to realize we are at war, so get this. Last night, there were enemy planes over this community. Why bombs were not dropped, I do not know. It might have been better if some bombs had been dropped to awaken the city. Now, if I can't knock these facts into your heads with words, I will have to turn you over to the police and let them knock them into you with clubs." And there were, of course, no Japanese bombers. In fact, the nearest were 5,000 miles away attacking Wake Island. But it was apparent that this city was not prepared for war. And it was equally evident that General DeWitt was not prepared for a blasé San Francisco. I'm Russ Coughlin.
Remembrance of War has been brought to you in part by the people of Chevron, by Express Mail Overnight Service, and by Citicorp and Citicorp Savings. The conclusion of Remembrance of War, the Bay Area, will be presented in a special one-hour program tomorrow night at 6 p.m. on Channel 7.